Okay, so today we're gonna dive into something that I think is like super relevant to probably a lot of you out there.
Yeah.
Folks who are building something new, whether that's a business or a project or even just, going through some kind of a big life change.
Mm.
We've got this really insightful piece from a business coach, Tony Feghali.
Mm-hmm.
And he really shines a light on these really challenging first few years
Right.
of building something new, what he calls the 0 to 3 stage.
That's right. Yeah. We're so often bombarded with these, success stories that are all like up and to the right, hockey stick growth.
Bruh.
And you know what Figali does that's, I think, so valuable is he really pulls back the curtain on what those first 3 years
Yeah.
can actually be like. And he talks about how so many of the coaching conversations he has
Yeah.
with people in this phase are filled with, really different stories.
Right.
People second guessing themselves, feeling burnt out, just feeling like they're constantly, treading water.
Yeah, totally. And I think, we've all heard those whispers, right?
Yeah.
Like, the friend who kind of quietly wonders if they made the wrong decision
Right.
to leave that stable job, or the founder who hasn't, paid themselves in months.
Yeah.
And I love how Feghali really gives this period a name, he calls it.
Right.
Fragile, messy, soul-shaking,
Mm-hmm.
which I think really captures it.
It does.
And what I thought was really eye-opening was what he said about where the real threats lie in this period.
Right.
It's not necessarily...
Well, and that's what's so interesting, right? Because I think, especially, if you're coming from kind of the traditional business world,
Yeah.
there's this idea that, competition is this huge external threat.
Right.
But what Feghali is pointing out is that the bigger threats
Yeah.
during this phase are actually internal.
Right.
It's the fatigue,
Yeah.
the isolation, the constant self-doubt
The self-doubt.
that can really creep in,
Yeah.
and even the danger of, kind of losing touch with reality a little bit.
Yeah.
And so it's this really interesting contrast to that pressure we often feel
Right.
to be constantly, scaling and growing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're bombarded with those messages.
Right.
Right. Of,
Mhm.
you need to scale. You need to be achieving
Yeah.
hockey stick growth.
Right.
And Feghali kind of flips the script on that.
He does, yeah.
His core message for navigating this 0 to 3 period, I think, really boils down to one word: staying.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, staying focused, staying the course.
Yeah.
It's about survival amidst what can often feel like just utter chaos.
Totally.
It's about, keeping your eyes on those immediate challenges,
Right.
maintaining your core focus,
Right.
and maybe most importantly, as he puts it, staying your dead
Yeah.
during this time when there's so much pressure
Yeah.
to kind of become someone you're not.
Yeah, and I think that's such a valuable reminder, for anyone who's out there feeling that weight
Right.
of those expectations to grow really rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of brings us to how Feghali sees the role of coaching
Yeah.
in these really early stages. And,
Yeah,
it's maybe not what you would initially think.
Yeah.
It's not about jumping right into these like really elaborate strategic plans
Right.
and rigid organizational structures.
No, absolutely not. It's,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that he stresses is that while strategy and structure are absolutely important,
Yeah.
they're not the first priority.
Right.
The fundamental need is to survive, but to survive with structure.
Right.
To bring a sense of clarity to this inherent messiness,
Right.
and crucially to support the individual
Yeah.
who's actually, in the trenches building this thing.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense because
Right.
as he highlights, so many of these really promising early ventures
Yeah.
don't actually fail because the core idea was bad or the product itself was bad.
Right.
He really sees the real stumbling blocks often being things like the founder losing their drive.
Yeah.
Or, making these critical errors like scaling too early or hiring employees before they really need them, or getting kind of fixated on what he calls vanity metrics.
I love that too.
Like having,
Right.
a huge number of followers on social media,
Right.
but not actually, having paying customers.
Right. Things that don't actually translate to
Yeah.
a sustainable business.
Right.
Yeah.
And he offers some really, practical and actionable insights.
Yeah, he does.
Kind of a survival guide, I think, for this phase.
I think so.
So let's unpack some of those key insights.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because I think this is where it gets really helpful for you listening.
Okay.
One of the first things that really jumped out at me was
Okay.
his emphasis on, having a 90-day runway rather than, focusing on some sort of like 5-year strategic plan. What's the core thinking there?
Well, I think it's fascinating because it's, a 5-year plan
Yeah.
can feel so abstract
Yeah.
and so distant.
Right.
And the reality is, when you're in the day-to-day
Yeah.
building something new,
Totally.
things change so quickly.
Right.
So what he suggests is, focus on a much shorter,
Right.
more manageable time frame.
Right.
90 days, and really think about,
Yeah.
what are the resources I need, and what's a clear path to viability within that time frame.
Right.
It's about, near-term survival and traction.
Yeah.
Rather than, getting lost in these
Yeah.
long-term projections.
Exactly. Yeah, that feels so much more manageable,
Right.
when you're in the thick of it.
Right.
Another really powerful point he makes is about focusing on solving a single problem for one paying customer before even thinking about trying to attract, a massive user base.
Yeah.
What's he getting at there?
Well, I think he's speaking to that need for early validation.
Right.
Before you even consider widespread adoption.
Right.
You really need to prove that your solution actually resonates with at least one person enough that they're willing to pay for it.
Right.
It's about, that targeted effort and real-world confirmation.
Right.
Not spreading yourself too thin, trying to appeal to everyone.
Right.
And I think that focused approach not only, helps you get that validation, but it also gives you really valuable feedback.
Right.
That helps you, kind of build a stronger foundation.
Yeah, and I think another piece of that is that, there's this temptation early on to kind of, be everything to everyone.
Oh, yeah.
And really kind of water down your value proposition.
Exactly. And it's so easy to fall into that trap.
Totally.
Especially when, you're eager to get those early customers.
Yeah.
But what Feghali is really advocating for here is, depth over breadth.
Exactly.
Really solving a problem deeply for a smaller group.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to be everything to everyone.
And I really appreciated his point about prioritizing being human.
Yes.
Over looking like a founder.
Yeah.
Because in today's world, there's so much pressure.
Oh my gosh, yes.
To project this image of the, always on hyper successful entrepreneur.
Right.
But he really brings it back to the importance of self-care and authenticity.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's so important because, this phase is so demanding.
Right.
And if you're not taking care of yourself, you're going to burn out.
You're going to burn out.
It's as simple as that.
Right.
And the other thing I love about that point is that, I think authenticity in those early interactions can often build much stronger connections with your customers.
Absolutely.
People can sense when you're genuine, when you're passionate, and that's often what draws people in.
Yeah, it's like that idea that people do business with people that they know, like, and trust.
Exactly. Yeah.
He also touches on this like inevitability of pivots and mistakes during this phase, and he reframes those in a really helpful way. He talks about the value of every no as information, and that momentum beats perfection.
Right. I love that. And I think that's such a critical mindset shift.
Yeah.
Because, in the early days, your ability to learn and adapt quickly is everything.
Yeah.
And so every rejection, every perceived failure is actually giving you valuable data that can help you, refine your approach. And this idea that, momentum beats perfection.
Yeah.
That, forward progress, even if it's not flawless, is more valuable than getting stuck trying to, achieve this unattainable perfection.
Right.
I think that's so key to staying motivated and continuing to move forward.
And then there's this, really strong recommendation to seek out a coach or some kind of support system.
Yeah.
And he positions that not as a luxury, but as like a fundamental need.
Right.
He says it's like oxygen when gasping in month 13.
That's a great analogy. And I think what's so insightful about that is it really highlights that, having that external support can be absolutely crucial, and especially during those inevitable moments of doubt and those really challenging times.
Yeah.
It's about having someone in your corner who can offer that objective guidance, a fresh perspective.
Yeah.
And just that boost of encouragement, when your own motivation is wavering.
Yeah.
And I think it really underscores this idea that building something significant is rarely a solo journey.
Which leads perfectly to his point about the danger of waiting too long to ask for help.
Yeah.
He talks about this badge of grit that so many early stage founders seem to wear almost proudly.
Right.
This notion that, I have to figure this out on my own.
Right.
And while resilience is important,
of course,
he cautions against taking that to an extreme.
Right.
Trying to navigate every single challenge in isolation
Yeah.
can lead to exhaustion.
Right.
It can lead to wasted effort, building things that don't resonate.
Yeah.
It can lead to, fundamental issues like incorrect pricing going on addressed for way too long.
Right.
And he reframes these setbacks as feedback.
Right.
But he stresses the importance of having that external perspective
Yeah.
to help you interpret that feedback constructively rather than just internalizing it as a personal failing.
And I think that's where, having a coach or a mentor or somebody you trust can be so valuable.
Right.
Because they can help you see those setbacks as opportunities for growth and learning.
Right.
Rather than, reasons to beat yourself up.
So from Feghali's perspective,
okay,
what exactly does a coach do during this, intense 0-3 stage? What kind of support are they actually offering?
Well, he really sums it up beautifully by highlighting these fundamental questions that a coach will ask.
Okay.
What do you genuinely need today? What are the aspects of this that are currently draining you the most?
Right.
What would make this whole endeavor feel just a little bit lighter?
Right.
It's about providing that space to kind of step back and reassess and acknowledge those challenges and be reminded that it's okay to adjust your course.
Yeah.
It's okay to prioritize rest.
Yeah.
It's okay to define success on your own terms.
Right.
Rather than trying to adhere to these kind of arbitrary external benchmarks.
Yeah. So it sounds like, in this context, a coach is really wearing a lot of different hats.
They are. Yeah. I mean, he talks about how, sometimes they're acting as a strategist, helping you with planning and clarity.
Right.
Other times they're serving as kind of like a mirror.
Yeah.
Reflecting back patterns or blind spots that you might not be seeing.
Yeah.
They could be that challenging voice, constantly bringing you back to the needs of your customer.
Yeah.
And then, maybe most crucially, they're providing that source of belief in your vision, especially during those moments when your own belief may be wavering.
And, he wraps up his piece with a really powerful and encouraging message for anyone who is in that, demanding 0-3 phase.
Yeah, he does.
What does he say?
Well, he offers this message of solidarity.
Okay.
He says, if you're in your 0-3 stage, I see you. You're not behind. You're building.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be this difficult.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important because it's so easy
to feel like you're doing something wrong when things are hard.
Right.
But what he's saying is, no, that's just the nature of building something from scratch.
And I love how he reframes the idea of success.
Yeah.
Not as this kind of, distant and often unrealistic finish line.
Right.
But as he says, the permission to build something that feels like you making one brave, messy aligned decision at a time.
Right.
And I think that really takes the pressure off.
It does.
That immediate, often unattainable definition of success.
Right.
And brings the focus back to this personal journey.
It does, yeah. It's a much more sustainable and ultimately more human-centered perspective on this whole process.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into, Tony Feghali's insights, the key takeaway here, I think, is that this 0-3 stage is a really unique and often demanding period.
It is.
It requires a real focus on survival.
A commitment to constantly learning from the wins and the setbacks.
Right.
And a dedication to staying true to that core vision.
Yeah.
All while resisting this, often,
very
overwhelming pressure to scale prematurely.
Yeah.
And And as Feghali points out, finding support
Yeah.
in whatever form that resonates with you
Right.
seems to be absolutely crucial for successfully navigating this time.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
His encouraging words really remind us that,
Right.
the difficulty is often just part of the journey.
Yeah.
Not a sign of failure.
Not at all.
And having the right support can make all the difference.
So as you're reflecting on Tony Feghali's wisdom, I want you to consider this. What is one brave, messy, aligned decision you can make today?
Oh, I like that.
It doesn't matter what 0 to 3 stage you might find yourself in.
Right.
Whether it's launching a new business, embarking on a personal project, or navigating, a significant life transition.
Right.
What is one small, intentional step you can take right now towards building something?
I love it.
That truly feels like you?
That's great.
That's your food for thought. From this deep dive, thanks for tuning in.